Under the fading light of a red desert evening, the horizon bled into shades of amber and dust. The land was quiet except for the slow, uneven rhythm of a horse's hooves dragging through the dry earth. Each step carried the weight of a man who had seen too much and lost even more. The wounded Apache rode with a stiffness that spoke of pain buried deeper than flesh. His chest was marked with dried blood. His eyes with something older, something that time itself could not heal. Behind him, the wind whispered across the mesas, carrying the scent of rain that never came. Ahead, the dying sun cast its last fire across his face, revealing the strength of a spirit that refused to break. He had been gone for weeks, maybe months. No one in the nearby settlement could say for sure. Some believed he was dead, claimed by the same border wars that had swallowed so many others. Others said they had seen him once, barely standing, bleeding into the sand, his horse nudging at his shoulder, as if urging him not to surrender. But the desert has a way of hiding its secrets until it's ready to give them back. And that evening, it returned one alive, though not unscarred. The Apache came back not for vengeance nor for pride. He came back for a permissive vow that clung to his heart stronger than the pain that tried to silence him. The small settlement of Dust Creek lay quiet under the orange glow of dusk. A few wooden homes leaned against the wind as though tired of standing. The saloon light flickered like a dying lantern, and the sound of a lonely fiddle played somewhere in the distance. People lived slow there, bound by routine, wary of strangers, and even warier of stories that sounded too much like hope. When the wounded Apache appeared at the edge of town, leading his horse with one hand pressed to his ribs, silence swept through the dusty street. Conversations died mid-sentence. A glass shattered somewhere. The only sound left was the creaking of a swinging saloon door and the soft thud of his boots. Against the ground, no one dared to speak first. They all remembered what had happened last spring, how the army had come through, how blood had soaked the soil outside the settlement. They remembered who had been taken and who hadn't returned. The Apache had been one of them once, though not by birth. He had saved a man's life years ago, and in return, that man had called him brother. But peace in those lands never lasted long. The frontier had its own laws, written in gunpowder, pride, and grief. When war rose again, lines were drawn, and friendships were tested by fire. Now, the man they once trusted stood before them, broken yet unyielding, carrying not weapons, but something far heavier, the ghost of a promise. From behind the saloon door stepped a woman, her eyes sharp against the fading light. She froze when she saw him, her breath catching as if the wind had been knocked out of her. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it by clutching the folds of her worn dress. She had dreamed of this moment every night since he left, dreamed of hearing his horse before the dawn, of seeing that familiar shadow cross the ridge. Yet seeing him now, alive but so changed, felt like standing between two worlds, the one she had mourned and the one that refused to die. Her voice came soft, almost a whisper. "You came back?" He looked at her, the corners of his lips barely moving, his gaze steady and unreadable. "I said I would." His words carried the slow cadence of someone who had spoken too little for too long. Then, after a long pause, he added, "I had to." The crowd began to disperse, their fear giving way to unease. Some muttered about curses and bad omens, others shook their heads. Unwilling to believe that a man could walk out of a battle that had left so many buried, but the woman didn't move. She watched him take a few more steps before his knees wavered and his hands slipped from his horse's mane. The animal whinnied low, circling him with the same care as a guardian. She ran forward, catching his fall just as his strength gave out. His blood stained her sleeve, but she didn't flinch. "Easy," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "You're home now," smiled faintly, but his eyes were far away, fixed on something she couldn't see. "Home," he repeated, as though testing the word on his tongue. Then he whispered something softer, something she barely caught. "The promise isn't broken." That night, as she tended to his wounds inside her small cabin on the edge of town, the wind carried the smell of smoke from the hills. Something was burning out there, perhaps a camp, perhaps something worse. The world beyond their walls still stirred with danger, and though the war had moved on, its shadow lingered. He lay on the bed, his chest rising shallowly, his breath uneven. She cleaned the blood, her fingers gentle but sure. Every scar she uncovered told a story, one he had never spoken aloud. Finally, she asked, "What did you promise?" His eyes opened slowly, the firelight reflecting in them. "That I'd come back," he said, voice hoarse. "And that when I did, nothing would take me from you again." There was something in the way he said it, something final, as if the words themselves were a binding vow. She looked at him, trying to read what he wasn't saying. The silence between them stretched long, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this time fate would be kind. But the look in his eyes carried the weight of something unfinished, something waiting beyond the horizon. The days that followed passed like quiet storms. The Apache healed slowly, his body mending while his spirit wrestled with memories that refused to rest. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he would wake suddenly, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Other times, he would sit outside before dawn, staring toward the hills as if expecting someone or something to come. The woman stayed close, but didn't press him. She knew that whatever had wounded him wasn't just made of bullets and blades. It was older, heavier, and still unfinished. One evening, as the sun bled into the plains, he saddled his horse again. His movements were careful but certain, his strength returning with purpose. She stepped out of the cabin, her heart tightening. "Where are you going?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The sky above them burned gold, and for a moment it looked like the world itself was holding its breath. "There's something I left behind," he said finally. "Something I need to face before I can stay." Her voice broke slightly. "You just got back." He looked at her then, really looked long enough for her to see everything that words could not say. "I'll come back," he said softly. "I gave my word." As he mounted the horse, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain from the far horizon. She wanted to run to him, to hold him there, to beg him not to go. But she didn't. She only watched as he rode toward the setting sun, his figure shrinking into the dust, the sound of hooves fading into silence. That night, the first storm in months rolled over the desert, lightning flashing across the empty sky. She stood by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon, whispering his words under her breath, words that were both a prayer and a plea. Somewhere out there, beyond the thunder and the burning hills, the wounded Apache rode again. But this time, he wasn't running from war. He was riding toward something far more dangerous, a promise that demanded to be kept. And though no one in Dust Creek knew what awaited him, one thing was certain. When he returned, the wind itself would remember his name. The storm lingered through the night, washing over the desert like a long-awaited confession. By morning, the earth smelled alive again, and the sky stretched pale and wide above the hills. She stepped outside the cabin, her boots sinking slightly into the softened dirt. The rain had left everything quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world was holding something just beyond hearing. His tracks were gone now, washed clean by the downpour, and she wondered if that was how the desert erased those who left it one storm at a time. Inside, the air still held the faint scent of smoke and medicine. His things remained where he had left them, a worn saddle, a pouch of herbs, and a knife with a handle wrapped in faded leather. She touched them carefully, her fingers tracing the marks carved into the blade. They were Apache symbols, old and sacred, though she could only guess their meaning. Every piece of him carried history stories told through scars and silence. She had known him for years, yet there were still corners of his soul she had never seen. Perhaps that was the way with men who had lived through too much. They gave what they could, and the rest stayed buried in the dust. The people in town had begun to whisper again. Some said he had gone to meet his old kin, that the mountains called him back. Others believed trouble was brewing across the plains, that the soldiers weren't done with the land they claimed. No one trusted quiet for too long out there. Quiet meant something was waiting. She tried to ignore their talk, but every word settled in her chest like a stone. She had watched him ride away once before, thinking he'd never return. Now, after all the pain and promises, the thought of losing him again felt like losing part of herself. Days passed slowly. She worked a small piece of land he had helped her fence years ago, feeding the chickens, tending the horse he had left behind. It was a tall, dark stallion with intelligent eyes and a restless spirit. He would stand at the edge of the corral some evenings, staring toward the hills as if he too was waiting for his master. She often found herself speaking to the animal softly, telling it the things she couldn't tell anyone else. "He'll come back," she'd whisper. "He always does." But as the days turned to weeks, the promise began to waver in the stillness. One evening, the horizon burned with the light of another sunset, and she felt a familiar ache in her chest. The world had grown quieter, emptier, like it was forgetting him. She refused to let that happen. So she rode out just far enough to see where the land began to rise, where the trail split into two directions. She found a piece of his old bandana caught on a branch near the ridge. It was small, torn, but it was proof that he'd been there. She tied it around her wrist and turned back. Her heart heavy but steady. Far beyond the ridge, he rode through lands few dared to cross. The storm had slowed him, but it had also hidden his trail from anyone who might be following. His wounds ached under the weight of travel, yet he didn't stop. The world around him felt older here, untouched by the noise of towns or the cruelty of men. He could hear the distant cry of hawks, the rustle of dry grass, the whisper of his ancestors in the wind. Every step forward was a reminder of why he couldn't turn back. There was a promise to keep. And promises like his weren't made with words, they were bound in spirit. He reached a narrow canyon by nightfall, its walls painted red by firelight from a distant camp. He dismounted and moved quietly, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. The air smelled of smoke and pine. Somewhere beyond the bend he could hear voices low, careful, and familiar. When he stepped closer, he saw 3 men sitting around a fire, their faces marked by the same heritage as his. They looked up as he approached, surprise flashing across their eyes. One of them rose slowly, his expression torn between disbelief and relief. "We thought you were gone," the man said. The soldiers said no one survived. The wounded Apache nodded. They almost told the truth. The others exchanged glances. The one who spoke first gestured for him to sit. "You shouldn't have come back alone. They're moving south again. The valley isn't safe." Apache lowered himself beside the fire, the heat touching his face like an old memory. "I didn't come for safety," he said quietly. "I came for what was taken." For a moment, no one spoke. The flames crackled, painting shadows across their faces. Then the younger one leaned forward. "You mean her, don't you? The woman from Dust Creek?" He didn't answer, but the silence said enough. The others looked at each other, uneasy. "If they find out," the first man said, "they'll come for her again. They don't forgive what they can't control." "I know," he replied. "That's why I have to end it." The night stretched deep and restless. Around the campfire, they spoke little. Words weren't needed between men who understood loss the same way. They carried it like a second skin. When dawn came, he mounted his horse again. One of them placed a hand on his arm before he left. "If you go back, you may not return this time." He met his friend's gaze, calm and certain. "Then I'll make sure my promise does." Back in Dust Creek, the air grew tense as riders began to pass through against soldiers in worn uniforms, their boots stirring up clouds of dust. They asked questions about raids, about stolen supplies, about an Apache seen riding near the old mining trail. The people of the town offered little more than nervous glances and half-truths. She stayed quiet, pretending not to know anything, though her heart hammered every time they mentioned his name. When they finally left, the silence they left behind felt even heavier than before. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and the moon cast long shadows across the wooden floor. She sat by the fire, staring at the bandana still tied around her wrist. Somewhere out there, he was fighting for something neither of them could name. Her thoughts drifted to the first time she had met him, the day the river had flooded near the canyon. She had been trying to save a small boy caught in the current, and he had appeared from nowhere, diving into the raging water without hesitation. When he pulled the child ashore, his own body was bruised and bleeding, but his eyes were calm. She had asked why he risked his life for strangers. He had answered, "Because someone once did the same for me." From that moment, she had known he carried a weight bigger than himself. Now, years later, That same weight had brought him back into the fire, and she could feel that something was coming, something inevitable. The desert never kept secrets for long. By the next morning, a traveler arrived from the south, claiming the army had lost men near the canyon. He spoke of ambushes, of camps burned down in the night, of a lone rider seen vanishing into the hills. She listened quietly, her heart torn between fear and pride. She knew that rider. She knew his silence, his resolve, his refusal to be defeated. But she also knew that every battle took a piece of him that no one could give back. That evening, she walked to the edge of the ridge, where he had last been seen. The wind carried the faint sound of thunder again, though the sky was clear. She stood there for a long time, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. "If you can hear me," she whispered, "don't forget your promise. Don't forget me." Somewhere far beyond the ridge, the wounded Apache rode through the deepening dusk. His body weary, but his spirit unbroken. The land stretched endless before him, wild and unforgiving. He carried no map, no guide, only the memory of her voice, the warmth of her touch, and the vow that had pulled him back from the edge of death. In a world where loyalty was rare and peace even rarer, love had become his only compass. As night fell once more, the wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of smoke from a distant fire and the faint cry of an eagle. The Apache tightened his grip on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The storm that had washed the earth clean had also stirred something restless in the sky, and, deep within him, he knew it wasn't over yet. What waited beyond the hills was not peace, but reckoning. And before the sun rose again, he would have to face what he had left behind, or be lost to the desert forever. The wind carried the sound of hooves across the valley long before the dust appeared on the horizon. The wounded Apache rode through the dry canyon, his horse slick with sweat, his eyes scanning the jagged ridges that framed the trail. Every instinct told him he was being watched. The land itself seemed alive with warning, the hush of birds, the distant howl of a coyote, the faint glint of something metallic far above the ridge. He knew the soldiers were close. They always were. The army didn't forget its ghosts, especially not ones that had embarrassed them in battle. The trail bent sharply, leading into a narrow pass where the rocks rose like old scars. He stopped for a moment, listening to the wind. Somewhere ahead, water trickled faintly through a creek bed, but it wasn't the sound that held his attention, it was the silence that followed. He dismounted, resting a hand on his horse's neck, and crouched low against the earth. The soil was disturbed, fresh tracks, too neat to belong to travelers. They were waiting for him. He whispered to the horse, a soft command, and the animal moved quietly toward the shadows. Then he stepped forward, one hand near his knife, the other brushing against the ground, like he was feeling the heartbeat of the land itself. When the ambush came, it came fast. The crack of rifles shattered the silence, bullets striking the dust where he had stood seconds before. He rolled behind a boulder, his breath steady, despite the chaos. The air filled with smoke and sand as he drew his weapon, the blade flashing in the broken light. A soldier's boot scuffed behind him. He moved like the wind, swift, silent, certain. The man fell before he could fire again. Another shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. The Apache didn't wait to hear the rest. He mounted his horse and rode through the gunfire, the sound of hooves and thunder merging until both were one. By the time the shots faded, he was miles away, hidden beneath the jagged shadow of an old rock formation. He slid from his horse, his shoulder bleeding again where a bullet had grazed him. He pressed a hand against the wound, steadying his breath. The army wasn't just hunting him. They were searching for something they believed he had taken a secret that had nothing to do with land or gold. It had begun months earlier, back when the settlement first became part of the new frontier. There had been a raid, and during that chaos, something valuable disappeared from the soldiers' hands. No one knew what it was, only that they blamed him for it. Though he hadn't stolen anything, he had taken something far greater, their pride. That was enough. In Dust Creek, word of the gunfire reached town by nightfall. A trader passing through told stories of soldiers scouring the desert, of smoke rising near the old mines. The townsfolk listened nervously, casting glances toward her cabin at the edge of town. Some said she was cursed for loving a man the army wanted dead. Others said she was the only one brave enough to understand him. She ignored their whispers, though each one cut deeper than the last. She knew the world they lived in didn't forgive love that crossed lines drawn by men who'd never known the desert's silence. That night, she couldn't rest. The sound of the wind against the roof reminded her of the storms he used to ride through. She sat by the window, the lamplight flickering across her face. On the table beside her was his knife, left behind the night he first came home wounded. She ran her fingers over the handle, feeling the symbols carved into it, the same ones she had seen on his blade by the firelight. They spoke of loyalty, endurance, and the eternal bond between two souls promised to each other by spirit, not by law. He had once told her that when an Apache made a promise, it was bound by blood and memory. Even if death comes first, he had said, the promise still stands. But promises didn't stop bullets or hunger or fear. The world beyond her walls was changing fast. The settlers were pushing further west. The army was claiming land that had once been sacred. And people like him were caught between two worlds and wanted by both. She felt it too. The small town that had once offered her safety now felt like a trap. Every passing soldier looked at her as though she carried secrets she didn't understand. Every stranger's arrival made her heart stop for fear it was someone bringing bad news. The next morning, a boy came riding hard from the southern ridge. He was young, his horse covered in dust, his face pale with fear. "They're saying he's dead," he blurted out before catching his breath. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, everything around her went still. She stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "Who told you that?" The boy hesitated. "A scout from the fort said they found his horse near the canyon, said there was blood." She didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned, grabbed her coat, and started toward the door. The boy tried to stop her, but she was already gone. The desert stretched endless before her, every shadow and ridge familiar from years of waiting. She rode until the sun began to set, the sky burning gold above her. When she reached the canyon, she saw the tracks, faint but clear, and something in her chest tightened. His horse was there, tethered under a rocky ledge, still saddled but alone. She dismounted slowly, her fingers brushing the worn leather. Then she saw the trail of blood leading deeper into the pass. The air was heavy with silence. She followed it carefully, every step echoing against the canyon walls. When she finally saw him, he was leaning against a boulder, his face pale but his eyes open. Relief and anger hit her all at once. "You fool," she said, her voice breaking as she dropped beside him. "You said you'd come back." He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "I am back." His words were quiet, but they carried that same stubborn warmth that had always undone her. She pressed a cloth against his wound, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't have come alone," she whispered. "They're hunting you." He closed his eyes briefly. "They've always been hunting me." As night fell, they stayed hidden in the canyon, the stars bright above them. He told her about the ambush, about the soldiers who wouldn't stop until they destroyed what was left of his people's land. "They think I took something from them," he said. "But the only thing I ever took was my freedom." She listened, her heart heavy with the truth she had always known but never spoken. The world didn't care for men like him, men who stood between survival and dignity. But what the soldiers didn't understand was that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every promise ever made under that burning sky. The next morning, the sound of riders echoed faintly through the canyon. He stood slowly, wincing but steady. "They've found us," he said. She looked toward the ridge, her pulse quickening. "Then we go together," she replied. He turned to her, his eyes softening. "They catch us, they won't show mercy." She met his gaze without fear. "Neither will the desert." He handed her his knife, the same one she had held the night before. "If I fall," he said quietly, "keep riding. Don't look back." She shook her head. "You fall, I fall too." There was no time for more. The first gunshot cracked through the morning air, striking the rocks beside them. He pulled her toward cover, the horse rearing behind them, air filled with the sound of shouting, hooves, and dust. She caught a glimpse of the soldiers at the ridge, their rifles glinting in the light. He fired once, forcing them to scatter, then turned to her. "Go!" he shouted. The battle in the canyon raged as the sun climbed higher. Each shot echoed through the valley, a reminder that the frontier had no peace to offer. By midday, the gunfire had faded, replaced by the low moan of wind winding through the rocks. She stood beside the wounded Apache, their breaths shallow, the silence between them heavy with everything they hadn't said. Far in the distance, more riders approached, the kind who wouldn't stop until the story ended in blood or dust. The promise still stood, unbroken but trembling under the weight of fate. The desert held its breath once more, waiting to see which would give first, the man, the vow or the love that refused to die. The air in the canyon was thick with heat and dust, the kind that clung to the lungs and made every breath feel like fire. The wounded Apache stood with his back against the rock wall, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed through the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls like ghosts from a forgotten war. He could tell from the rhythm to riders, maybe 3, scouts most likely. The army would not stop until they found him, and when they did, they would bring enough men to burn the land flat. He pressed his palm against his wound, feeling the sticky warmth of blood beneath his fingers. Pain meant he was still alive, and being alive meant the promise still held. She crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the ridge. Her heart was pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. "You can't fight them like this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He looked out toward the trail, his jaw set, his eyes sharp. There was no fear in him, only purpose. He had lived his whole life between 2 fires, hunted by men who called him enemy, betrayed by the peace that never truly came. Yet now, as danger closed in again, his thoughts were not of survival, but of her, of the life he had promised once the fighting stopped. The sound of voices drifted closer. She could make out their words, now orders shouted, boots crunching against the gravel. "They're coming," she whispered. He nodded once, slowly. "Then they'll find what they came for." He tightened his grip on his rifle, though the metal felt heavier than ever. The desert sun burned bright overhead, casting long shadows that crawled across the ground like creeping smoke. When the first soldier appeared at the bend, the Apache didn't move. The man raised his rifle, scanning the area, unaware of the 2 figures hidden among the rocks. Another soldier followed, then a third. They were careful, deliberate, moving as though they knew what kind of danger the land could hold. The Apache waited, silent as the earth itself. Then, in one swift motion, he fired. The shot cracked through the still air, and the first man fell. The others shouted, ducking behind cover as dust exploded around them. She covered her ears, her body trembling, but she didn't run. She couldn't. The canyon erupted into chaos. Gunfire tore through the silence, ricocheting off stone, echoing for miles. The Apache moved with instinct, shifting from rock to rock, his movements sharp, despite the blood soaking through his shirt. The soldiers tried to flank him, but the land was his ally. It bent and curved to his advantage, hiding him where no map could lead. She crawled toward him, gripping the knife he had given her, her heart racing with fear and fury. When she reached his side, he turned to her, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "Neither should you," she replied, her eyes burning. For a moment, they locked eyes, the noise around them fading into the distance. In that instant, the world felt suspended between 2 heartbeats. Then another bullet shattered the air, striking the rock beside them. He pulled her down, his body shielding hers from the spray of dust and stone. She could feel his breath against her cheek, quick and uneven. "Can't stay here," she said. He nodded, glancing toward a narrow crevice further up the slope. "There," he said. "If we reach it, they'll lose sight of us." They ran, the ground shifting beneath them, bullets biting at their heels. The horse whinnied from where it had been tied below, restless and frightened. The soldiers shouted again, their voices carried by the wind. When they reached the narrow gap between the rocks, she stumbled, catching herself on a ledge. He turned back, reaching for her, his hand closing around hers just as the ground gave way beneath her feet. For one breathless second, she hung between the sky and the earth, her fingers slipping, his grip tightened. The strain in his wounded arm made his vision blur, but he didn't let go. "Hold on," he growled, his voice breaking. "I'm not letting you fall." With a desperate pull, he hauled her up beside him. They collapsed behind the rocks, gasping for breath. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, shaking. "You said we'd make it," she whispered. He managed a faint smile, though pain flickered behind his eyes. "We're not there yet." The shots grew more distant, the soldiers slowing their pursuit. The canyon stretched far below them, a maze of shadow and sun. They stayed hidden until the sound of hooves faded. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. "They'll be back," he said. "They won't stop until they find us." She looked at him, her face pale. "Then where do we go?" He stared out toward the horizon, where the land met the sky in a shimmering line. "North," he said finally, "to the river. There's a place they won't follow." They moved as the sun sank, their shadows long against the blood-red light. The journey was slow, every mile heavier than the last. His wound burned with each step, but he kept moving. She tried to help him, but he refused to lean on her. Pride was as much a part of him as the dust and the wind. When night fell, they made camp near a dry ravine. The stars stretched endless above them, sharp and cold. She gathered what little firewood she could find while he cleaned his rifle in silence. After a while, she sat beside him, the firelight flickering against their faces. "Why do they hate you so much?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his expression distant. "Because I remind them of what they destroyed," he said finally, "and of what they couldn't." His voice carried a quiet strength, but beneath it was something darker. Grief, perhaps, or guilt. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against the rough skin of his palm. "You've done nothing wrong," she said. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Maybe not, but they'll kill me just the same." The fire crackled between them. In the silence that followed, the night seemed to grow colder. She wanted to tell him that everything would be all right, that they could leave this place and start over somewhere the world didn't know their names. But the words felt too small against the weight of everything pressing down on them. Instead, she leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, slow and careful, and for a moment, it felt like the storm had finally passed. But peace never stayed long in the desert. By morning, the sound of horses returned closer this time, steady and deliberate. He woke before dawn, his instincts sharp even through exhaustion. She stirred beside him, sensing the change in the air. "They found us," he said quietly. She sat up, her eyes wide. How, he didn't answer. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was betrayal. It didn't matter now. He saddled the horse with quick, practiced movements. "We head to the river," he said. "If we can cross before they reach the pass, we have a chance." She climbed behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist as he urged the horse forward. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the land in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, the riders came into view, a dozen this time, maybe more. The chase tore across the open plain. The wind whipped through her hair as the horse galloped faster, the sound of pursuit closing in. Bullets sliced through the air, one grazing the saddle, another striking the dirt beside them. He pushed the horse harder, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body screaming from the effort. The river was still miles ahead, silver thread glimmering in the distance. She turned her head, catching sight of the soldiers closing in. "They're gaining," she shouted. He didn't look back. "Hold on," he said. The horse stumbled for a moment, nearly losing its footing, but recovered. The river drew closer, its roar growing louder. For a fleeting second, she thought they might make it. Then a shot rang out, sharper than the rest, and he jerked in the saddle, his body lurching forward. She screamed his name, grabbing him before he fell. Blood spread across his shoulder. Dark and vivid in the morning light. He tightened his grip on the reins, fighting to stay upright. "Don't stop," he gasped. "Not yet." The horse plunged down the slope toward the water hooves, kicking up mud and spray. Behind them, the soldiers shouted, their voices lost in the roar of the river. The current was strong, wild from the storm that had passed days before. He guided the horse into the rushing water, the cold biting through flesh and bone. She clung to him, her tears mixing with the spray. The river pulled at them, fierce and relentless. The horse struggled against the current, but the Apache held firm, his strength fading yet unbroken. On the far side, the land rose steep and dark, a place untouched by roads or men. Freedom was within reach, but the river was merciless. The roar of pursuit blended with the thunder of the water, and as the soldiers reached the bank, the Apache turned his head just once back toward the land he had fought for, the promise he had made. And the love that had anchored his soul through every storm, the current surged, swallowing the sound of gunfire, leaving only the echo of the river and the rising sun burning across the sky. The moment hung like a held breath, the outcome uncertain, suspended between survival and sacrifice. Between the promise kept and the one about to be broken, the river roared like a living thing, wild and untamed, carrying them through the churning current. She held on to him tightly, her fingers digging into his soaked shirt as the horse fought to stay upright against the rushing water. The world around them blurred the spray, the shouting. The thunder of hooves on the far bank, all of it became one long sound of chaos and willpower. His body was heavy in her arms, his blood mixing with the cold river water, yet he didn't let go of the reins. His eyes were fixed ahead on the rising bank that marked safety, on the last promise he had yet to keep. When they reached the far side, the horse stumbled onto solid ground, trembling and gasping for air. She slid down, pulling him with her, his weight collapsing into her arms. His breath was shallow, his skin cold, despite the morning sun beginning to warm the earth. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to the wound in his shoulder, her hands shaking. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're almost there." His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she saw that same quiet strength she had fallen in love with. He tried to smile. "I told you I'd come back," he said softly. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking at the edges of his words. "You did," she answered, her voice trembling. "And I'm not letting you leave again." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand finding hers. The world around them felt still now, as if the desert itself was watching, waiting. She could hear the river behind them, the distant cries of soldiers on the other bank. But they didn't cross. The current was too strong, the water too deep. For the first time in days, there was silence, fragile, uncertain. But real. They made their way slowly through the trees that bordered the far valley, finding shelter beneath a low cliff where the land curved inward like an embrace. She gathered dry grass and wood, lighting a small fire that flickered weakly in the morning air. He sat beside it, pale and worn but alive. The flames painted his face in soft gold, and she thought he looked almost peaceful, even with the pain etched into his features. "You should rest," she said. He shook his head. "Not yet. There's something I need to tell you." She turned to him, her eyes full of worry. He looked out toward the open plains beyond their hiding place, his gaze distant. "That day they came for my people. I wasn't supposed to survive. The soldiers thought they had destroyed everything, our homes, our names, even our stories. But they didn't understand. A promise made under the sun can't die with the man who makes it. It lives on in whoever remembers it." His voice grew weaker, but there was pride in it still. "You remembered me. That's how I found my way back." She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "You came back because you wanted to live," she said softly. He smiled faintly, his eyes warm. "No. I came back because I wanted you to live." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of sage and wet earth, the remnants of the storm that had saved them. She leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. It was slow, steady, fading in and out, like the rhythm of the land. "We'll start over," she whispered. "We'll go north. Find a place where no one knows us. No soldiers, no war." He closed his eyes, as if imagining it. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But wherever I go, I'll always be here." He touched her chest lightly, just above her heart. That's where promises stay. The days that followed were slow and quiet. She cared for him as best she could, tending his wounds, gathering water from the river, now building small fires to keep them warm at night. The soldiers never crossed the current, and the land beyond the valley seemed untouched, safe in a way that felt almost sacred. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and see him sitting by the fire, staring up at the stars. When she asked what he was thinking, he would only say, "I'm listening." She never asked what he meant, but deep down, she understood. He was listening to the land, to the wind, to the ancestors that still walked with him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber and rose, he turned to her and said, "You should go back." She froze, shaking her head. No, I'm not leaving you. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. You have to. They'll come again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will. And when they do, you can't be here. You have a chance at a life beyond this valley. I don't. She grabbed his hand, her voice breaking. Don't say that. You're not dying here. We'll make it together. He looked at her gently, his thumb brushing away her tears. Together doesn't always mean in the same place. It means in the same heart. The next morning, she woke to find him gone. His blanket was folded neatly beside the fire, his footprints leading down toward the river. Panic rose in her chest as she followed them, calling his name into the still air. When she reached the riverbank, she found his horse grazing nearby, its reins tied loosely to a branch. On the ground beside it lay his knife, the blade catching the sunlight. She picked it up, running her fingers over the carved symbols she had traced so many times before. Then she saw him, standing on the opposite side of the river, where the mist was rising from the water. He looked strong again somehow. His hair moved gently with the wind, and his face carried a calm she had never seen before. Their eyes met across the distance. She wanted to shout, to beg him to come back, but no words came. He raised his hands slowly, a silent farewell, a promise kept. Then he turned and walked into the hills until the light swallowed his figure, leaving only the echo of the river and the whisper of the wind. She waited for him that day, and the next, and for many after. Sometimes she thought she heard the sound of hooves in the distance, or caught the scent of smoke on the breeze. She kept his knife with her always, its weight a reminder that love wasn't something the world could take. Years passed, and Dust Creek grew quieter. The soldiers moved on, the wars shifted to other lands, and the desert healed itself with time. When travelers came through the town, they often spoke of a story a wounded Apache seen riding at dusk near the canyon. His horse black as night, his face turned toward the fading sun. Some said he was a ghost, a spirit bound by love. Others swore he was still alive, protecting the valley that had once nearly taken him. She never corrected them. She only smiled and said, "He's keeping his promise." In the evenings, she would walk to the ridge where the land met the horizon. The wind there was softer, carrying the warmth of the sun long after it had set. She would close her eyes and listen to the river, to the silence, to the heartbeat of a memory that never faded. And somewhere in that quiet, she always felt him near. The wounded Apache had returned with his horse and a promise of eternal love. And in the end, that promise was the only thing the world couldn't break. It lived on in her laughter, in the land they had crossed, and in every whisper of wind that moved through the canyon at dawn. The desert kept his name, the river carried his story, and the woman who had once feared losing him came to understand that love, when bound by the soul, never truly ends. Even years later, when the sky burned red with another sunset, the people of Dust Creek would sometimes see her standing by the edge of the valley, her hair catching the light, her eyes fixed on the horizon. And they would say that she was waiting, but she wasn't. She was remembering, because promises like his were not meant to fade. They were meant to last forever, carried by the wind, sealed beneath the sun, and written in the quiet heart of the land that had once brought them together.